Nations worldwide are reclaiming treasures looted by colonial rulers, an important part of their history and identity. But do the artefacts risk being destroyed because of a lack of proper care? And how does their restitution affect the future of Western museums? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. As much as 90% of sub-Saharan Africa's cultural artefacts are outside the continent, mostly in European museums. That's according to a report commissioned by French President Emmanuel Macron. He kick-started the global movement to return looted artefacts in 2021, when former colonial power France handed back 26 treasures to Benin. The movement isn't restricted to countries in Africa. Many Latin American and Asian nations have followed suit, demanding the return of their historical objects and artworks from former occupiers. It's given rise to global debate. Can developing countries, short of funds, preserve the centuries-old artefacts that they are reclaiming? And what's the future then of prestigious Western museums, many of which have exhibited these treasures for decades? We'll discuss all of this with our panel of guests in a moment. But first, this report from Jessica Washington. She's in Jakarta with more on the historic collections on show in Indonesia's National Museum, including artefacts returned by its former Dutch rulers.
In central Jakarta, this building has a history older than the nation of Indonesia itself. It opened to the public in the late 1800s and was officially called the National Museum in the 1970s. But last year, an electrical fire tore through the building, damaging or destroying some of the priceless artefacts inside.
According to our data, there were around 900 collections affected by the fire, including a mix of organic and non-organic materials. There is metal, there is bronze. There are also materials such as wood. Many also experienced serious damage, especially organic ones, because the fire was so huge.
The museum was closed for 1 year to renovate and repair the building and to restore some of the collections. Some say the fire also provided an opportunity to rethink the museum's purpose and create a more curated, interactive experience for visitors.
We are carrying out a fundamental transformation of the National Museum and learning from past experiences, preparing not only the physical infrastructure, but also human resources. Of course, it will require further development in coming years, but I can say that we are ready to accommodate the artefacts.
It reopens its doors with an exhibition called Repatriation, meaning repatriation, which celebrates the return of historic artefacts from the Netherlands to Indonesia.
Now we can see firsthand the history of our country. I'm happy to see them and know Indonesia more deeply. Now we have to prove we can take care of these objects so younger generations can also see them.
Some of these objects were in the Netherlands as part of a diplomatic cultural exchange initiative, but many were taken during the colonial occupation era. Before returning these artefacts, the Dutch government noted that many of these items should not have been in the Netherlands in the first place, stating that during the colonial period, cultural artefacts were often looted or changed hands involuntarily. The repatriated objects include these 4 Hindu-Buddhist sculptures taken from Java to the Netherlands in the first half of the 19th century.
It's like a healing process, with the return of these items which were taken by the Netherlands by force. Indonesia is not interested in repatriating a huge number of artifacts. What's important is that we select objects with strong cultural, historical and religious values for communities here. For me, the most valuable item is the Diponegoro Keris, which is called the Silent Dragon. I was directly involved in its repatriation. The process took more than 2 years. This is a high-profile cultural object. People have been looking for it for 190 years.
More than 80 objects were recently repatriated. Most have not yet gone on display, as staff at the museum work to carefully unbox all the items, including these doors, which were taken from a Balinese kingdom.
We can be proud of bringing the artefacts home. Caring for them well should make us even more proud.
Other items on display include artefacts returned in recent years by the Netherlands, including ancient weapons and extravagant gold and diamond jewellery. For Inside Story, Jessica Washington, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
As we've said, the African continent has been at the centre of the restitution movement. Perhaps the most prominent case has been the Benin bronzes, sculptures and plaques that British soldiers looted from what's now Nigeria in 1897. Many European museums have since returned their items, but the British Museum, which holds the largest collection of Benin bronzes, has refused to part with them. Some former colonial powers agreed to return the artefacts on loan to their countries of origin. In April, the UK returned for a 6-year period dozens of gold and silver treasures stolen from what is now Ghana. And the University of Cambridge has returned to Uganda historical items taken by British colonial administrators in the 19th century. The 3-year loan deal allows for the possibility of local ownership. Nicholas Hack has more on the African restitution movement from the Senegalese capital, Dakar.
Welcome to the Black Civilization Museum in Dakar, Senegal. Now, this particular room is dedicated to art coming from the African continent. And look at it. It's almost empty. Why? Because most of what should belong inside this museum is found in museums in London, Paris, New York, or Berlin. For a Senegalese family to try to understand its past, to see pieces that belong, or art pieces or history pieces that belong to them, they would have to attempt to get a visa to Europe and do the costly journey to those European museums. It's almost inaccessible. And so, there is a movement driven not by aging intellectuals, but by young activists to try to get those objects back, those objects that were taken and looted during the colonial time. Some of these activists have filmed themselves going inside museums like the Quai Branly in Paris, saying that these objects do not belong inside the museum, but belong on the African continent. Some of them have been fined up to 1,000 euros in doing so. But their aim is to fill this empty space with their own history. These are not artifacts for them, but objects of everyday life. Some of them are, in fact, sacred objects. And so the idea here is to bring back these objects here so that people can understand their own history, so that the people here on the African continent can move forward. Nicholas Hawke, Al Jazeera, Dakar.
Well, let's bring in today's guest to discuss all of this. From Durban in South Africa, we're joined by Byera Ijumba, the Senior Researcher at Open Restitution Africa, that aims to provide more information on the return of African cultural objects from former colonising states to the countries of origin. In Utrecht, Jos Van Beurden is Senior Researcher on Colonial Cultural Collections and Restitution and author of The Empty Showcase Syndrome. He's also the founder of a 3,000-strong global network of heritage experts called Restitution Matters. And in London, Barnaby Phillips is the author of Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes, and a former colleague of us here at Al Jazeera. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. Jos, let me get from you the scale and the scope of what we're talking about globally. I mean, we don't know, do we, how many items there are? And while you're telling me about this, also perhaps first, we keep hearing this word restitution. For our viewers who don't know what that means, just explain that as well.
Well, restitution, essentially, it's bringing back what is not ours. It's quite simple. But then we get to the next part of it. Bringing back, is that only loot? And typical for the restitution debate of the last years is that we have broadened this concept of loot into involuntary losses of possession. And that's what restitution is about. Because you were in the film from Indonesia, you saw these Javanese statues. And these statues, they were not looted during war or conflict. They were smuggled out of Indonesia, we should say now. But they are also part of a deal to bring back objects.
And Jos, on my other question, on the scale and scope of this worldwide, do we know, because I think we've probably got a pretty good idea what are in big Western museums, but obviously there's things in the hands of private collectors, and one assumes that's a bit like looking at the bit of the iceberg that's under the water.
Yes, well, that is a very good point you're making, because I'm getting more and more the impression in talking with art dealers, with auctioneers, and even with private collectors, that almost half of all the collections from colonial regions are in private hands. That means that if we talk about restitution and we limit ourselves to state-owned collections, we do only half of the job.
Karen, we used that figure at the start of the programme, 90% of Africa's cultural heritage located outside the continent. That's from a report quite a few years ago now, produced for President Macron. Would you say that estimate is about right?
I would say the estimate is about right. And I think if you look at Benedicta Savoy's more recent work, Atlas of Absence, looking at Cameroonian objects that are missing or located in Cameroon and had been removed from, are located in Germany and had been removed from Cameroon. There's a probably even bigger number that we don't understand, because the records in Europe themselves have not been kind of meticulously kept as well. So I think our numbers are a guesstimate, but we are definitely missing a lot more than we understand that we're missing, because our records are not meticulous or complete.
Barnaby, what does the law say on all of this? Because there is international law. There is, I believe, something called the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export and transport of ownership of cultural property. But I don't think it applies to any of this stuff, does it? It doesn't apply to colonial times.
It's not retroactive, James. So if you're talking about the Benin bronzes or the Ashanti gold or the looting of Magdala or the looting of the Summer Palace in Beijing or Lucknow in the 1850s, it's irrelevant. Laws vary from European country to European country. They vary to the United States. I mean, primarily we're talking about the laws in the western part of the world here in terms of objects that might, or you might say should, go back to Africa. And then, of course, laws vary within individual countries. So you're talking about the British Museum refusing to give back Benin bronzes. Well, the British Museum is constrained by a law called the British Museum Act, which applies uniquely to it. Now, in the past, undoubtedly, many people at the British Museum have hidden behind that act and, you might say, used it as an excuse not to give back, say, the Pathon Marbles or the Benin bronzes. But there are also people at the British Museum who would like that act to change, and they don't have the power to do it. That would be done through the British Parliament, whereas, for example, British university museums or British municipal museums do have a lot more freedom to act unilaterally, and in some cases they have done so.
Well, we might come back, I think, to the case of the UK a little bit later in our discussion. Jos, when I was looking and reading about this subject, I came across a news story right the way back from 2002, and it was a joint statement by some of the world's best-known museums and galleries. It said, objects acquired in earlier times must be viewed in the light of different sensitivities and values reflective of that earlier era. Museums serve not just the citizens of one nation, but the people of every nation. It seemed pretty unapologetic reasoning for keeping these things. How much have things changed in now more than 20 years since then?
I remember one colleague from Africa saying about that 2002 declaration, this is the last defense wall of the major museums in the northern global sphere. And so much has changed in them. The globalization has brought people closer to each other. Ethics are changing. There has been the diaspora movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, there is more equality, economic equality, between former colonies and former colonizers. And former colonizers, they have an interest that's also behind Macron's policy towards Africa, to have good relations with African countries. So much has changed in the last 20 years that, you know, nobody. I remember talking with the Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, which was one of the signatories of the 2002 declarations. And they say, nowadays, we would never sign such a declaration anymore.
Karen, I mean, among the arguments that have been made in the past is that these are big, rich museums with lots of experts and resources, and they can properly protect and secure the future of these works for generations. That line of argument suggests that these smaller nations would not be able to. It sounds somewhat patronising and perhaps still stuck in a colonial mindset, would you not say?
I think absolutely. And I think if you look at restitution in a very limited way in terms of understanding it as return of things, as opposed to looking at the fact that taking of the things was a rupturing of spiritual systems, it was rupturing of cultural systems, of knowledge systems. And so the return is not just simply centered on whether a particular institution can take care of things. It's about returning so much of what was disrupted or violated or broken when those things were taken and in the moment that those things were taken, and addressing that and addressing the dynamics that allowed that to happen and how we don't continue it to happen for the present and future generations as well. So I think focusing on just museums and their capacity to care takes away from the fact that we had those things before, we had capability to take care of our own things. And that return is about returning more than just the thing. It's about returning the world that was taken from us.
And it's worth adding, Barnaby, we saw Nicholas Hack at the start of the report at that museum in Dakar. There's a new museum of West African art in Benin City. Give us a little bit of a plug for how some of these nations are dealing with this, Barnaby. What do you think they've got the right facilities now?
I think there's a general acknowledgement that the type of museum that African countries were left with at the time of independence was a colonial model. And it hasn't always worked. And countries like Senegal or Nigeria are looking for new models. There's an exciting new museum opening in the middle of Lagos, the J.K. Randall Museum, celebrating Yoruba culture. And it is opposite what is often, I'm sorry to say, the rather moribund National Museum, which is the old British-built museum across the road. So that's an illustration of the way forward. But it's not going to be straightforward at all. For example, you mentioned the new Museum of West African Art that's opening in Benin City. Well, that has been caught in some very vicious politics involving the central government, involving the Oba, that's the traditional ruler of the Edo people, who's the great-great-grandson of the man who was overthrown by the British. And so that is a fraught process. And for example, something like 50 fantastic Benin bronzes have been returned to Nigeria over the past 2 to 3 years. You can see one of them there. Not a single one is on public display yet, nor, and it gives me no pleasure to say this, nor is this a matter of huge popular discussion in Nigeria at the moment. A lot of the debate around this is coming from the West. And I think this fits back to something Karen was saying, which is that this was such a rupture, and repairing it and finding the right way forward is very, very complicated. And just handing objects back that's easy, if you like, if you feel like doing it, but it doesn't necessarily solve much by itself.
Jos, we mentioned at the start of the programme what President Macron did a few years ago and the comments that he made and the report that he commissioned. Let me ask you, though, has he followed through on that? And do you think that Macron's intervention did kickstart something in other European countries?
Well, yes and no, because he was the first European head of state who said such a thing. But what we often forget is that, why did he say it? Because France had received a claim from the Republic of Benin for 5,000 objects which had been looted. Most of them had been looted in 1892. And Macron had to do something with it. And often we forget the power of the former colonies, to reclaim their treasures. And so for me, it starts in 2016 with this claim of Talon. And then there came a follow-up from Macron in 2017, and then the report came, etc. So it was important, but we should not forget the voice and the power and the influence of the former colonizers. That's the same for Indonesia, what we started with, and the same for Nigeria, etc.
Karen, I mean, we've talked about so much art and treasure around the world, but there are, and we've mentioned some of them, these very specific, iconic pieces. Tell me, for example, Barnaby will tell us in a moment about the Benin bronzes, but with regard to the Benin bronzes, I mean, what is the significance, would you say, to people and the connection with the identity of people in that part of Nigeria?
I think I can't speak specifically to Benin bronzes, but I can speak more broadly to some of the case studies that we've looked at. And I'll speak to the Tuka Mask, which is in Cameroon. And that was something that was very central to a spiritual and political system in the Bamadu community. And you'll find that a lot of time when these artifacts were removed from the space from where they were from, there's a binding or reading into of other systems that were broken as well. And for them, it was also that their environment started speaking back to them to say they have lost something. So where there was certain environmental disasters, or where there was a certain kind of drought that was happening at that time, it was found that those things were kind of linked to the fact that a spiritual and politically significant artifact had been removed from their community. And what people, I think, are trying to do now in trying to return those cultural belongings, which is what we like to refer to them as, is that they're trying to not only return the physical thing, but to be able to re-understand how is it that we used to organize ourselves? How would we celebrate? How would we rule ourselves? And how would we speak to our landscape, to our kind of ancestral realms through these kind of objects? And that relearning is then happening for a younger set of Bamadunians in the Cameroon region. And I think it's a similar experience for people who are sitting maybe in Nigeria as well. But a lot of the time, it's being able to grasp onto to something and to be able to relearn not just the object itself, but all the world and knowledge and spirit and power that used to surround that as well. And I think that is a very reaffirming and redignifying thing for a lot of Africans.
Barnaby, back to the Benin bronzes, which you wrote a book on. I mean, I think it shows the complexity of some of these issues, doesn't it? Because many accounts say that the Benin Kingdom were slave traders. There are some in the US who say that they shouldn't go back to what is now Nigeria. It shows the difficulties here.
The past is a messy and a complex place, undoubtedly. And I think there is a danger that we see the past in very black and white terms. I think it's possible to say, for example, that there were aspects of the British Empire that were greedy, rapacious, cruel, racist. That doesn't mean that everything about the Ashanti Kingdom or the Benin Kingdom was wonderful. We shouldn't see it in simplistic terms like that. And once you start picking at these threads, undoubtedly, all sorts of contradictions do come out. That, I agree.
Jos, I mean, if we look at the former colonial powers, we focused a bit on the UK. I'm going to stay with the UK. Barnaby was talking earlier on about the UK's position on this, the law that governs certain UK museums. I mean, if you were to say which country of the former colonial powers was not doing its bit, would you say that's the UK?
No. Yes, no. I don't like hierarchies. And what Barnaby pointed to already is that many university museums, Cambridge, Oxford, Edinburgh, Glasgow, they have been returning ancestral remains, they have been returning objects. And so, don't generalize. But the British Museum is a problem. But there is one good thing is that the new Minister for Culture, Lisa Nandy in the UK, said at the Labour Party Congress in Liverpool that she wants to reconsider this whole discussion about the Pathon Marbles and about restitution. So, yeah, at this moment, the Netherlands are rather advanced. Germany is very advanced. I think they're very good in provenance research. France is a bit disappointing. Belgium is not very fast. But, all the time, these positions, they change. And let's just go on.
Barnaby, he mentioned the Pathon Marbles. In the UK, they're known as the Elgin Marbles. Not only were they looted, they're named after the man who did the stealing. Now, the UK government, the current Labour Party government, has a massive majority, it could return anything it wanted, couldn't it?
It could, actually. It would have to change the law. I mean, it's interesting. Jos is absolutely right. Lisa Nandy, so she's the new culture secretary, did make these remarks about the Pathon Marble the other week. But in fact, the previous Conservative government was also looking for a deal, possibly around the Pathon Marbles. But I, for example, James, had lunch last week with a Labour member of Parliament who's somebody of African heritage, who's somebody who's been very outspoken on issues of restitution. And I still had the feeling that she did not feel that she had her hands on the levers of power, if you like. And without wanting to get too UK focused about this, you wonder whether a new Labour government in this country, which is struggling on so many fronts with big economic and social and political issues and international instability, is really going to spend a lot of political capital on something that will get it dragged into what we might call the culture wars. I mean, hopefully they will. Don't get me wrong. Hopefully they will engage with this issue. I mean, the Pathon Marbles, the Elgin Marbles, in the words of a British Museum trustee, it's a boil we need to lance, that we all need to move on. We need resolution on this issue.
OK, Karen, quickly from you to sum up our discussion. On this issue, generally, would you say you are optimistic things are getting better, if rather slowly?
I don't think, as both Jos and Barnaby have said, it's a very complex issue. And I think trying to measure whether we are getting better or not is very difficult, because with each new case that comes in, there are different kinds of challenges that come up. And even from kind of our research that we're doing, we're seeing just the context that you're in influences what your restitution process is going to look like. So to say we can gauge we're in a better place or not, I think goes from a case-to-case basis. And we're not really at a point where we can say we are moving forward with restitution or we are stuck at a particular point. It's just an ongoing and continuously dynamic and fluid process. And I think the most important thing is to center how we are renegotiating our conversations with each other and how much room we give each other to actually repair the rupture that was made.
Thank you very much, all of you. It was a fascinating discussion. Makes me want to go and visit a museum very soon, particularly if I can get to Indonesia or West Africa. Thanks to Karen Byera Ijumba, Jos Van Beurden and Barnaby Phillips. If you missed any of this programme, don't worry, you can catch it again on demand on our website, aljazeera.com. We always want to hear from you too. Please add your thoughts on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can find us on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'll be back here again very soon. Until then, from me, James Bays, and the team, stay safe. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.